June 4th, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil trembled as Unteroffizier Burkhardt wrote in his hidden diary, words that could have earned solitary confinement if discovered. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Through the train window, he had just witnessed what contradicted 3 years of propaganda. Electric lights blazing from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop. A constellation of electricity stretched across the Texas plains at 10 p.m. In Germany, blackout regulations had enforced darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification had reached barely 20% of farms. Yet here, in the so-called decadent and collapsing America, electricity flowed like water. 850 veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps stepped down from the train. Not cattle cars, not freight wagons, but cushioned Pullman coaches with dining service and sleeping berths. The people of Mexia gathered to watch, unaware they were witnessing the start of a profound psychological transformation, the systematic demolition of Nazi ideology through exposure to American abundance. The collapse had already begun in Tunisia. On May 13th, 1943, General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered with 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops. The Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had once driven the British to Egypt, now stood as prisoners. Among them was Oberst Friedrich Radke, Iron Cross First Class, veteran of France, twice wounded in North Africa. His diary, preserved in the National Archives, gave historians the most detailed account of the psychological shock of American captivity. At Oran, Algeria, American efficiency struck the first blow. Radke and 30,000 others waited in makeshift camps for transport. The U.S. Army processed thousands daily with organizational precision unmatched even by Germany at its height. Identity cards were photographed and filed. Medical examinations completed, inoculations given, Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German. The first true shock was food: white bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote to his mother, "In the cage at Oran, we ate better than in 6 months of desert war. We thought it was propaganda. We did not realize this was their standard ration." The Atlantic crossing delivered the second stage of demolition. Liberty ships were monuments in steel. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser's Richmond Yard. At peak, 3 such ships launched daily. By summer 1943, they carried up to 30,000 prisoners per month, returning from supply runs. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann noted in letters home, "The crew discarded more food waste each day than his company received in a week of rations. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk poured away." Not as mockery, but because supply was limitless. Prisoners learned that 2,910 Liberty ships would be built, each requiring 250,000 parts manufactured across 32 states. Engines were assembled from cylinders produced in 3 different factories, then shipped to ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauborn recalled, "As our ship approached the coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. We believed only we, or perhaps the British, possessed such technology. Here it was standard on a cargo vessel. At that moment, I suspected Germany had already lost." August the 2nd, 1943, Norfolk, Virginia. The first sight of America erased remaining illusions. The naval base covered 4,300 acres. In a single day, it handled more tonnage than Hamburg in a week. A factory worker turned soldier, Johann Weber, counted 47 cargo ships, loading or unloading. Each crane lifted what once required a dozen men and horses. They moved silently on electric power, without the coal smoke that darkened German cities. Prisoners marching to trains past parking lots filled with cars, hundreds of them owned by dock workers. In Germany, private automobiles remained a privilege of the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised since 1934, had delivered fewer than 1,000 civilian cars. Here, laborers drove daily. Then came the journey inland. Not 40 and 8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses, but Pullman cars, padded seats converted into berths, dining cars with white tablecloth and cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. We boarded like tourists, not prisoner, Radke wrote. Guards seemed almost embarrassed. One apologized that the air conditioning was not working properly. Air conditioning in 1943 in prison trains. Germans had believed such luxury reserved for Hitler's personal train. For 3 days, the trains rolled toward Texas and Oklahoma. Every town blazed with lights: Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, all glowing at midnight, their shop windows and signs illuminated, their factories running night shifts. Wilhelm Meyer, son of a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, wrote later, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Each had more electricity than all of Hamburg." At Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. Workers completed the operation in 30 minutes. Automated loaders, electric pumps, mechanized lubrication. A task that took 2 hours in Germany. Their boots, their cigarettes, their Coca-Cola bottles discarded half-finished, all signs of casual wealth. Hinrich Miller, an electrical engineer before the war, calculated that the yard used more electricity in 1 hour than his Berlin district consumed in a day. "The waste was magnificent," he wrote. "They left lights burning in empty buildings, fans running in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource." For 3 years, German propaganda had painted the United States as a hollow power. Newspapers and radio broadcasts described America as racially divided, politically unstable, and incapable of sustaining a long war. The Reich's Ministry of Propaganda insisted that American soldiers lacked discipline, that strikes crippled industry, and that the economy would collapse under prolonged mobilization. To the men captured in North Africa, these narratives had become part of their worldview. The journey through American ports and railways demolished those assumptions one by one. At Norfolk, prisoners watched cranes unloading ships at a pace that Hamburg could not match in a week. They marched past parking lots where ordinary workers owned cars, a level of private wealth unimaginable in Germany, where the Volkswagen had remained a propaganda promise for nearly a decade. Then came the Pullman coaches, with padded seats that folded into berths, dining cars with white tablecloths, observation windows stretching the length of the carriage. One German officer recorded with disbelief, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." Even small details cut deeply into prior expectations. A guard apologized that the air conditioning in one car was malfunctioning. Air conditioning was something German officers assumed existed only in Hitler's personal train. Yet here it appeared as a standard feature for prisoners of war. To men who had endured years of desert campaigns, the casual presence of such technology was more than comfort. It was a revelation that German assumptions about American weakness were untenable. Nighttime travel made the contrast even sharper. From their seats, prisoners saw towns blazing with light at midnight, factories running third shifts, storefronts glowing with neon signs. In Germany, blackout orders since 1940 had darkened entire cities. Rural electrification had never reached more than 20% of farms. Yet in America, light was so abundant that it was wasted in empty rooms and deserted stations. This was not the image of a divided, collapsing nation. It was the profile of a country overflowing with resources, confident enough to treat enemies as passengers rather than captives. Expectation and reality had diverged completely. For the prisoners, the propaganda voice of Goebbels no longer matched what they witnessed with their own eyes. The United States was not weak. It was powerful, organized, and secure enough in its strength to display abundance without fear. That recognition marked the first deep break between the ideology they had carried and the reality they now inhabited. The path from battlefield defeat to ideological collapse began not in America, but in North Africa. On May 13, 1943, General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the last Axis forces in Tunisia. The total, between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian troops, represented the largest capitulation of Axis soldiers to that point in the war. Veterans who had earned Rommel's reputation for tactical brilliance now stood in lines, awaiting transport. Many carried decorations, scars, and diaries that would become historical records of their captivity. Among them was Oberst Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, twice wounded in North Africa, a respected career officer. His writings, later preserved in the U.S. National Archives, offered some of the most detailed first-hand testimony of what came next. Alongside him were Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauborn from an aristocratic Prussian family, and Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a veteran of the 21st Panzer Division. Their words, scattered across letters, memoirs, and interviews, would illustrate not only their shock at captivity, but their confrontation with a reality beyond propaganda. The staging ground was Oran, Algeria. There, in makeshift enclosures near the harbor, tens of thousands of prisoners awaited transport. The United States Army, still relatively new to the European theater, demonstrated an organizational system that impressed even hardened German officers. Thousands were processed daily. Photographs were taken for identity cards. Files were meticulously recorded. Medical examinations were routine. Inoculations against disease were administered, sometimes by German-speaking officers who explained procedures with precision. Prisoners who had expected brutality instead encountered regulation and order. The true disorientation came from the food. For men who had endured half rations in the desert, the meals at Oran were unthinkable. White bread appeared at every sitting. Real coffee, unavailable to most Germans since 1939, was poured freely. Meat was served twice a day. Hans Müller later wrote to his mother, "In the cage at Oran, we ate better than in 6 months of desert war. At first, we thought it was deception, propaganda to soften us. We did not realize this was simply their normal ration." From Oran, the prisoners were moved to ships that would take them across the Atlantic. Here, the mathematics of war began to reveal itself in steel and schedules. The SS Robert E. Peary, a Liberty ship, had been constructed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, a feat German engineers would have dismissed as fantasy. At the height of production, American yards launched 3 such ships each day. In total, 2,110 would be completed. To avoid empty return voyages, these vessels carried up to 30,000 prisoners per month by the summer of 1943. Zimmermann, in letters preserved after the war, described the Atlantic crossing in stark terms. Each day, American sailors discarded more food than his company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. Half-eaten steaks, loaves of bread, gallons of milk, poured away without thought. This was not theater. It was casual, the waste of a system that regarded supply as limitless. "They did not throw it away to humiliate us," Zimmermann wrote. "They threw it away because it meant nothing to them." Other prisoners recorded equally startling impressions. Von Stauburn watched radar equipment rotating on the bridge of a cargo vessel and realized that technology, once considered rare, was standard issue in America. Rodka noted the demeanor of guards, disciplined but not cruel, confident without aggression. Muller observed how quickly rumors about American weakness dissolved once confronted with meals, technology, and order that contradicted everything the Nazi press had declared. Together, their diaries form a mosaic of the earliest stage of ideological collapse. The background of the story, then, is not merely defeat in Tunisia. It is the transition from a world defined by propaganda to one measured in kilowatts, tonnage, and calories. The prisoners entered Oran expecting hardship and humiliation. Instead, they encountered efficiency, regulation, and abundance. It was the first chapter in a long lesson that the war they thought they were fighting bore little resemblance to the reality of America's power. The industrial war that confronted German prisoners was not measured only in battles, but in numbers. Every statistic they encountered seemed designed to contradict what Nazi propaganda had promised. At first, the figures were scattered, production schedules overheard, tonnage observed, technical details offered casually by guards. Gradually, the mathematics of war assembled itself into a reality that no ideology could ignore. The Liberty Ship program became the first textbook in this arithmetic. American yards constructed 2,110 vessels during the war, with peak output reaching 3 per day. To German officers trained in naval logistics, the claim was absurd. Yet the proof was literal steel around them. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser's Richmond shipyard. Even seasoned engineers dismissed such speed as impossible propaganda. Then they learned it was fact, repeated across multiple yards. "We could not build a fishing trawler in that time," one prisoner wrote bitterly. The Germans, who measured ship construction in months or years, realized that the Americans had compressed the process to days. Scale, not brilliance, was the decisive factor. Prisoners soon discovered how Liberty ships fit into a larger equation. Each required 250,000 parts, sourced from 32 states, coordinated through supply chains that had been non-existent in 1940. Engines were built in separate factories, cylinders machined in one location, assemblies completed in another, final installation at ports. A system of distributed production allowed constant output regardless of local bottlenecks. German officers, accustomed to centralized yards vulnerable to bombing or labor shortages, began to understand why America could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Norfolk Naval Base reinforced the lesson with brutal clarity. Sprawling over 4,300 acres, its cranes operated day and night, loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. One day's work at Norfolk equaled a week's tonnage in Hamburg. Johann Weber, a factory worker conscripted into the Wehrmacht, wrote in his diary that he counted 47 vessels in different stages of loading. Each crane replaced the labor of a dozen men and horses, driven by silent electric power rather than the coal smoke that choked German ports. "They move without pause," he noted. "We cannot imagine such continuity in Germany. Our yards still stop for shifts, shortages, air raid alarms." Norfolk's uninterrupted flow illustrated a new principle, that logistics itself was a weapon. As prisoners traveled inland, they saw factories that further expanded the arithmetic. In Tennessee, the Alcoa aluminum plant stretched for miles along the river, its furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of electricity, more than the entire city of Munich. Rodka, an infantry officer, admitted in his diary that he could not fathom the concept. "They melt metal with the energy of a city," he wrote. For men from a nation where power shortages routinely disrupted industry, the Alcoa plant appeared less like a factory and more like an entire industrial region condensed into one site. Near Louisville, Kentucky, prisoners glimpsed Rubber Town, a synthetic rubber complex that had risen from fields in less than 2 years. 4 facilities, each employing thousands, produced 800,000 tons annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never achieved more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, recognized the implications instantly. "They have multiplied our invention sixfold," he said in a later interview, "and they did it with women, old men, and Negroes operating machinery. We told ourselves such a workforce was impossible. We were wrong." The most staggering lesson awaited near Detroit. The Willow Run plant, visible from passing trains, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak, 42,000 workers assembled aircraft from 1.55 million parts supplied by 1,500 subcontractors. The facility covered 2.5 million square feet and consumed more electricity than the city of Cologne. Prisoners pressed their faces against windows as rows of bombers stretched across the assembly floor. Feldwebel Heinrich Ferli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down in Tunisia, wrote, "We had been told American planes were inferior, rushed, fragile. I watched 17 B-24s in various stages, perfect in finish. They were not fragile. They were endless. Each observation chipped away at ideological defenses. The Germans had built their worldview on the myth of discipline and technical superiority. Yet in America, scale rendered those virtues irrelevant. Waste alone carried meaning. Zimmermann calculated that one railway yard consumed more electricity in an hour than his Berlin district did in a day. Müller, the engineer, observed that surplus food was discarded because regulations required cooks to prepare 10% more than needed. "They destroy what we cannot provide," he wrote, "not in cruelty, but because they do not notice." The culmination of this mathematical education arrived with news of D-Day. On June 6, 1944, German prisoners learned that the Allies had landed in Normandy with 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first wave. Within days, newsreels showed artificial harbors, supply pipelines, and endless convoys of trucks pouring across open beaches. The prisoners, already stunned by what they had seen in America, now recognized the operational consequences. Numbers were not abstractions. They were facts deployed at scale. One officer remarked, "It was not courage that defeated us. It was arithmetic." American intelligence officers monitoring prisoner attitudes noticed the shift. Reports spoke of ideological collapse syndrome, a phrase used to describe the moment when statistics overwhelmed conviction. The prisoners had once argued when shown charts of U.S. production. By late 1943, they no longer contested the figures. They had seen the cranes, the factories, the assembly lines. By mid-1944, the debate was over. The war had become a contest of capacity, and capacity had only one victor. The math of war taught German prisoners a lesson no lecture could deliver. Every number carried a message. 4 days for a ship, 63 minutes for a bomber, 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber, 175,000 kilowatts for aluminum. Against such arithmetic, the Reich's promises collapsed. The Germans had believed that discipline and willpower could overcome material disadvantage. In American captivity, they discovered that industry itself was the decisive weapon, a weapon measured in statistics that could not be denied. Statistics could not convey the full impact of captivity. To understand how ideology crumbled, one must read the words "prisoners left behind," diaries, Letters and memoirs captured the moment when propaganda dissolved into silence and men confronted the truth of their defeat. Zimmerman, the infantryman from the 90th Light Division, wrote frequently to his family. His early letters from Oran sounded defiant, assurances that Germany still held the initiative, that captivity was temporary. By the time he reached Texas, the tone had shifted. "I no longer argue when they show us figures," he confessed. "We see the trains, the factories, the food. It is too much. The propaganda voice in my head grows weaker each day." Von Stobern, descendant of a Prussian military family, kept meticulous notes later published in memoirs. He described the first time he saw radar on a Liberty ship. "We believed only we, or perhaps the British, possessed it in small quantity. On this vessel it was routine. I realized then that Germany was already defeated, not in courage, but in material." His aristocratic pride dissolved into reluctant admiration. He wrote of America as a nation that made industry a form of discipline and abundance a form of power. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, struggled between loyalty and recognition. In one letter home, he admitted, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners. White cloths, silver cutlery, even air conditioning. They apologized for what we considered luxury. How can I explain this to you? We were told they were collapsing. Instead, they carry us as if wealth were endless." His father, a Nazi party bloc leader in Hamburg, would never see the letter. It was intercepted by censors and preserved in American archives. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffman, chemist from IG Farben, wrote of Rubbertown in Kentucky. "I saw distillation columns taller than our factories, producing in months what we could not in years. Women and Negroes working calmly at machines more advanced than ours. We said democracy was chaos. Here chaos builds more than our order ever could." His testimony revealed not only technical shock, but ideological contradiction. The very groups Nazi ideology had despised now operated the machinery of victory. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a surgeon with the 164th Light Division, found himself astonished by medical facilities at Camp Hearn. X-ray machines, surgical instruments, penicillin, tools we had only heard rumors of. They use it on prisoners, even for minor infections. German soldiers are dying for lack of sulfa drugs, and here they treat us as patients worthy of their best medicine. His account later testified to Allied tribunals about the disparity between American care and German neglect. Other voices echoed despair and shame. Paul Fisher, a factory worker turned infantryman, wrote after working on American farms, "They eat meat as we eat bread. Their cattle herds stretch further than our villages. A boy of 16 drives a tractor worth more than my father earned in his life. We laughed at their supposed decadence. Now I wonder if we were the decadent ones." Walter Schmidt, a Bavarian farmer's son, captured near Tunis, described grain elevators along the Mississippi. "One barge carried more wheat than my province harvested in a year. I watched Americans loading food as we load ammunition, without concern for loss. I felt pride collapsing in my chest." His words convey the transition from arrogance to resignation. Even admiration crept into these documents. Von Stobern admitted, "This democracy we despised appears more honorable than our own system." Zimmerman wrote, "They separate us from Nazism itself. They tell us they fight Hitler, not Germany. I thought it was propaganda. Now I see they mean it." For men raised on racial superiority, the recognition was devastating and transformative. The voices of the prisoners, captured in fragile pages and censored letters, show the emotional dimension of collapse. Numbers explained what Germany lacked. Words recorded what men felt when confronted with that lack. Shock, shame, despair, and grudging respect merged into the same realization, that the Reich had challenged a society it never understood. In their voices, the demolition of ideology becomes human, not abstract. Each sentence is a fragment of surrender. The decisive transformation did not arrive in statistics alone. It came in moments when prisoners realized that abundance was paired with generosity. These moments destroyed the last defenses of ideology, replacing fear with recognition that Germany had lost not only the war, but its moral foundation. Christmas 1943 marked the first great turning point. Across the United States, churches, civic groups, and ordinary families prepared 500,000 Christmas packages for German prisoners of war. Cigarettes, candy, games, toiletries, even handmade cards from school children, filled parcels addressed to men who only months earlier had tried to kill American soldiers. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the local Methodist choir sang carols in German. Women from the town delivered homemade cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts carried greetings written in careful handwriting. Prisoners who had expected hostility instead received kindness. Only those certain of victory can treat enemies with charity, one officer remarked quietly. The statement spread through the camp as a whispered acknowledgment of defeat. The feast itself defied imagination. Turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, pies, and ice cream filled tables in quantities unseen in Germany since before the First World War. Feldwebel Hans Sauer wrote, "We ate like kings, better than generals, better than party leaders, and they told us this was ordinary, the same as every American family." The realization struck deeper than hunger. It revealed confidence. A nation able to feed enemies with such generosity clearly had no fear of loss. Comparisons with life in Germany sharpened the blow. Letters arriving from home described ration cards, coal shortages, and nightly bombings. Wives and children queued for bread while their husbands, held as prisoners, ate better than officers at the front. Dr. Friedrich Bauer testified that American hospitals treated prisoners with penicillin, a drug still unavailable to German civilians. The contrast destroyed illusions of superiority. Men who had once mocked America as decadent now felt shame for the suffering of their own families under Nazi rule. By early 1944, the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office noted a dramatic change. Requests for English classes, newspapers, and lectures surged. Prisoners voluntarily attended lessons on democracy, economics, and science. Camp newspapers shifted tone from defiant nationalism to debates about Reconstruction and governance. Ideological collapse had moved from whispers to open discussion. "They have seen too much," one intelligence officer reported. Propaganda no longer functions. The second great turning point arrived in June 1944 with news of the Normandy invasion. Prisoners crowded around radios and camp newspapers. Within days, newsreels showed the scale: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first wave. German soldiers who had witnessed Willow Run producing a bomber every hour now saw the operational outcome. Those bombers darkening French skies. Men who had counted Liberty ships in Norfolk now saw the convoys pouring across the channel. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, prisoners watched films of the invasion. Artificial harbors floated off the coast, pipelines delivered fuel under the sea, trucks rolled endlessly onto French roads. The magnitude defied comprehension. Oberst Radke, who had once mocked American efficiency, admitted in his diary, "It is finished. We see the organization of giants. We challenge mathematics with mythology." His words circulated secretly among fellow officers, many of whom had reached the same conclusion. For the enlisted men, the emotional impact was even greater. Zimmerman wrote home, "We thought courage could equalize weakness, but courage cannot build ships or grow food in such quantities. We now know the truth." Letters preserved in archives show similar admissions from dozens of prisoners. Ideology had collapsed not through argument, but through observation. Numbers had become ships. Ships had become landings. Landings had become undeniable proof. Christmas and Normandy together completed the demolition. One revealed the moral superiority of America, the other its material supremacy. Together, they convinced prisoners that resistance was pointless. More importantly, they planted seeds of admiration. Von Steuben, once proud of his Prussian heritage, confessed, "I see now that honor belongs not to conquest, but to the society that can treat enemies with dignity while defeating them utterly." Such statements, unthinkable months earlier, became common by late 1944. The turning point also altered behavior within the camps. Formerly fanatical Nazis grew silent. Pro-democracy newspapers flourished. Requests for American literature increased. Prisoners debated not how to return to Germany in triumph, but how to rebuild a shattered homeland. "We must learn from them," wrote Muller. "They show us not only machines, but ideas. Freedom, abundance, order. They combine these in ways we did not believe possible." By the winter of 1944-45, the transformation was visible to American guards. Hostility faded. Cooperation increased. Escape attempts, already rare, declined further. Prisoners volunteered for labor, sometimes requesting assignments that exposed them to American farms and factories. They no longer feared indoctrination. They sought education. The turning point had passed, and the war inside their minds was over. Christmas had shown that America's strength included mercy. Normandy had shown that its capacity was inexhaustible. Together they formed the twin blows that shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. What began in the desert of Tunisia had ended in the recognition that America's greatest weapon was not merely industrial might, but the confidence to wield it generously. By late 1944, German prisoners of war in America no longer measured their captivity in days. They measured it in comparisons. Each factory, farm, and camp facility revealed contrast between the world they had been taught to revere and the world they now inhabited. Those contrasts became the framework of what American intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome. For the first time, men who had sworn oaths to Hitler began to admit openly that their system had failed. Steel was the first measure. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed furnaces producing 10,000 tons daily. Endless trains of ore and coal arrived, feeding blast furnaces that never cooled. A single American mill produced more steel than the Ruhr at its peak. Paul Hartman, who had worked at Krupp before conscription, described it bitterly. "They waste more steel in spillage than we produce. Our laborers toil double shifts with slave workers. Here they complain of overtime while producing quantities beyond our dreams." To men raised on the myth of German industrial superiority, the sight was unbearable. The Reich's central resource had been outclassed completely. Food became the second measure. In Kansas, prisoners watched combines harvest wheat at rates that would have required 100 men in Germany. Grain elevators along the Mississippi held more wheat than the Reich imported in a year. Prisoner diaries compared American sandwiches, meat stacked thick on white bread, to the rations of their families at home. Otto Schultz wrote of California orchards where mountains of oranges were bulldozed to stabilize prices. "We begged to send them to Germany," he recalled. The guards shrugged. They said this was waste, a strategy to keep markets stable. For us, it was madness. For them, it was normal. Hunger and surplus had become opposites in the two systems. Transportation offered further contrast. Trains in America ran on schedules, prisoners considered miraculous. At Roanoke, automated loaders refueled and serviced locomotives in 30 minutes, a task that consumed 2 hours in Germany. One engineer calculated that the yard used more electricity in an hour than his Berlin district in a day. Cars filled parking lots outside every factory, each owned by ordinary workers. In Germany, automobiles remained the privilege of party officials. Volkswagen had been promised since 1934, but fewer than 1,000 reached civilians. In America, two-car households were becoming common. The system difference was not only industrial but social. Prosperity spread downward, not hoarded by elites. Agriculture widened the gap further. In Nebraska, a single farm stretched further than entire Bavarian counties. Combines replaced labor battalions. Fertilizers and mechanization doubled yields. German farmers still relied on horses and hand tools, while American boys of 16 drove tractors larger than any vehicle in their villages. Schmidt, a farmer's son, wrote, "One farmer here equals 100 of ours. He produces grain as we produce ammunition, without fear of shortage." When letters from home described shortages of bread and potatoes, the contrast became unbearable. Technology cut deepest. Prisoners saw radar on cargo ships, penicillin in camp hospitals, X-ray machines, and mechanized kitchens. American doctors treated even minor infections with drugs Germans considered miraculous. In factories, electric conveyor belts and automated canning machines replaced dozens of workers. A single elderly woman operated controls at a soup plant that would have required 50 Germans. For officers trained to believe that order and discipline compensated for lack of resources, the evidence was shattering. Democracy, which they had been told was weak, appeared instead as the source of technological superiority. Education revealed the final measure. By early 1944, more than 40,000 prisoners were enrolled in courses. Universities provided correspondence classes. Lectures on democracy, economics, and science filled camp schedules. Some prisoners studied English, others read American newspapers, comparing multiple viewpoints unthinkable in Nazi Germany. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz wrote, "We were told America was controlled by Jews, weak and divided. Every day I see the opposite. This is the most organized and powerful nation on earth." What began as reluctant attendance became voluntary enthusiasm. By late 1944, prisoners requested books and formed discussion groups. Camp newspapers, once defiant, now debated Reconstruction and democracy. The Special Projects Division carefully monitored the change. Reports described fanatical Nazis falling silent, while moderates grew bold. In Camp Kearney, Rhode Island, prisoner editors published essays on constitutional government. In Camp Shelby, Mississippi, German officers attended lectures on atomic physics, taught by professors, including Jewish refugees. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, later recalled, "They taught us without hatred. They said science belongs to humanity. I saw then that our system had not only lost the war, but lost its soul." The comparisons spread beyond economics. Prisoners noted how America treated minorities and women. Factories employed women as welders, machinists, and crane operators. African Americans worked in complex industries, earning wages Germans denied them even as slaves. Hoffman, the chemist, wrote, "We said democracy was chaos. Yet this chaos built factories larger than anything in Europe. We said racial mixing would weaken them. Yet Negroes operated machines we could not build. It was not weakness, but strength." The ideological contradictions were too stark to maintain. The consequences were visible in behavior. Requests for re-education multiplied. Prisoners asked for English classes, not because they were forced, but because they wanted to understand. Many began corresponding with American families through camp programs. Some requested to remain in the United States after the war. By 1945, over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. They wrote essays praising free markets and civil rights. Officers who had sworn loyalty to Hitler drafted plans for agricultural reform and industrial modernization in a democratic Germany. The system they once despised had become their model. One striking testimony came from Oberst von Stobern. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system. They feed us while bombing our cities. They teach us science while fighting us. They treat us with dignity while defeating us. What kind of system is strong enough to show kindness to enemies? Not ours, only theirs. His words, copied secretly among prisoners, encapsulated the collapse of ideology. American officers understood the significance. They described the process not as indoctrination, but as observation. Every full meal, every electric light, every efficient schedule was propaganda by reality. By 1945, German prisoners had become missionaries for democracy, not because they were coerced, but because they had seen it function. The comparison between systems was too visible to deny. Germany had built a dictatorship on scarcity and coercion. America displayed prosperity and freedom as the natural outcome of abundance. Thus, the great confrontation of systems played out not on battlefields, but in prison camps across America. Steel against steel, wheat against hunger, technology against stagnation, democracy against dictatorship. By every measure, the German system failed. The prisoners who once marched under swastikas now read American newspapers, studied American science, and prepared to rebuild their homeland in America's image. System had confronted system, and only one survived. By the war's end, the scope of German captivity in the United States could be measured with precision. In total, 371,183 prisoners were held across nearly 500 camps. They represented every branch of the Wehrmacht, from Afrika Korps veterans to Luftwaffe pilots and Kriegsmarine sailors. Spread across the American interior, their presence touched agriculture, industry, and even education. The most immediate consequence was economic. Shortages of labor had strained American farms and factories, and prisoners filled the gap. Records indicate that German POWs contributed more than 14 million man-days of agricultural work. They harvested crops in Kansas, cut timber in the Northwest, and picked fruit in California's Central Valley. Farmers who had once faced ruin because of manpower shortages credited prisoners with saving harvests. Payment went to the government, but many farmers recalled sharing meals and building unexpected familiarity with the young men who had once been enemies. Education marked another outcome. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in formal courses offered in the camps. Roughly 30,000 studied English. Universities provided correspondence lessons in history, economics, and mathematics. Instructors noted the intensity of interest. They no longer argued, one report stated. They asked questions. They wanted to learn. For many, these experiences became the foundation of new lives. An estimated 5,000 former prisoners later immigrated permanently to the United States, marrying American women or returning as professionals. Escape, the traditional measure of prisoner defiance, was almost non-existent. Fewer than 1% attempted to flee, just over 2,200 men. Most attempts ended quickly, often within miles of the camps. The lack of motivation reflected a larger truth. Conditions in captivity were better than conditions in Germany. For men whose families faced hunger and bombing, the thought of leaving relative safety and abundance made little sense. The consequences extended into post-war Europe. Prisoners returned with memories of efficiency, prosperity, and democracy. American authorities recognized this potential, deliberately encouraging re-education. Many returned to Germany determined to apply what they had witnessed. They brought knowledge of mechanized farming, industrial organization, and political pluralism. Seeds planted in captivity grew into the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of West Germany in the 1950s. In retrospect, captivity in America became one of the war's most unlikely weapons. Without coercion, without forced indoctrination, the system of abundance itself reshaped tens of thousands of Germans. The consequences could be counted not only in work performed and escapes prevented, but in lives redirected and ideologies dismantled. 4 decades after the war, the men who had once stepped off Pullman cars in Texas returned to America voluntarily. In 1985, more than 500 former prisoners gathered in Austin for a reunion. They came not as captives, but as visitors, many bringing children and grandchildren to show them where their transformation had begun. The voices that emerged at that gathering summarize the ultimate lesson of captivity. Hans Wehe, once an infantryman at Fort Robinson, told the audience, "Life in the camps was a vast improvement from what many of us had known in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food, but more than that, we discovered dignity." Another former prisoner, Kurt Meyer, recalled working on Iowa farms. "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared meals and knowledge. This humanity changed us forever." The most memorable words came from Hermann Gutz, who had arrived as a convinced Nazi. Addressing the reunion dinner, he declared, "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a cause. We left as Democrats." His testimony reflected not propaganda, but lived experience. Abundance had confronted ideology, and ideology had collapsed. The war had been decided not only by ships and aircraft, but by the ability of one system to show humanity while wielding unmatched industrial power. Historians later described America's secret weapon as neither bomb nor tank, but the combination of production and generosity. In the minds of German prisoners, that weapon proved decisive. They carried it home, planting the seeds of a democratic Germany that would rise from defeat. The lesson endured. Prosperity and humanity together could achieve what no propaganda ever could.